Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to have you here today. My name is Cindy McDonald. I'm a college counselor. I'm a career counselor. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a mom. I'm a grandma. I wear all those hats that we all wear. And I never thought I would be a producer or a podcaster, but here I am. So I'm so glad to have you. My goal is to bring you subject matter experts in the fields of education and business and have frank conversations with them. And these are topics that you really care about. So as you're coming into the Friday Forum, I do this about twice a month. Watch your emails and watch my website to see what dates and when they're going to be. But I'm glad to be here today. We're going to talk about a really important topic about how we shift gears when our students that we work with or our own children are shifting from a high school K-12 environment into college. And especially if they've had special accommodations, if they are neurodivergent, what does that look like? And we're going to talk about that today with my panel of wonderful experts, Heather Stout, Cody Marie Mathis, and Heidi. I can't even say your last name.
Potrykus, no problem.
Potrykus.
You got it.
McDonald, it's like I'm stuck. So as you're coming in, can you please put in your name and your location so that my guests can see where my audience is from? And we also have a question like, are you working with a student right now who has a 504 plan or an IEP? And then this way, not only will my panel get to see where you're from, we get to see kind of where you're at. So I'm glad to have everybody here and have you joined. I have the best audience ever. You guys are just so responsive, and I love hearing your thoughts and what things that you're interested in, and I try to bring those to you. So I want to thank Heather, Cody, and Heidi for being here. Cody Marie Mathis is the Disability Access Coordinator for Services for Students with Disabilities. That's a mouthful. At the University of Michigan. And so, and Heather Stout is the Director of Operations for the Disability Resources and Educational Services at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And Heidi Potrykus is founder of IEP College Prep, and she's the former director of I can't even talk today, Office of Disability Services at Marquette University. So thank you all three for being here today and for bringing your knowledge and expertise. You can see we've got somebody from Nebraska, Midland University. Glad to have you, Garrett. We've got people Colorado, Melissa from the Bay Area, just all these. Jareen, she is, her note taker is in here. So we have a school counselor, glad to have you here. You can see we have people from all over. So let's talk about what it means to have, when we're advising students in these areas, when we have a student 504 or an IEP, what does that mean? So Heidi, I'm going to turn this over to you.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. We're going to start off with kind of a common question that a lot of IECs have out there, which is, Cody, can you answer, would you recommend a student with a disability to disclose their diagnosis in their college applications, the pros and cons, and what you think would be appropriate from your expertise?
Yes, thank you, Heidi. Hi, I'm Cody Marie. So the college application process, this is one of those maybe areas. It's never a firm yes or no. I will say that college application processes cannot take into consideration as part of their admittance process a disability. So, and usually they do not ask. An appropriate time would be if you need accommodations during the actual application process. Do you need a guide during tours? Do you need an interpreter? Does somebody in one of your parents need an ASL interpreter? Do you need captioning? Things like that may be accommodation based. But as far as disclosing disability during a college application process, that would not be the place that I would start as a student, nor would I recommend that students start there. Like I said, there's no shame in disclosure. It isn't, it is part of who you are. If it's part of your college essay, you can weigh those factors that it may play into whatever prompt that they have. And so it's really sitting down and going, is this a necessary to share? And how, in looking at this university, how am I presenting it? If I'm just blurting out like other things you need to know on my application, oh, by the way, I have dyslexia. That would not be where I would put that information. It's not secured. It's not a necessary. It does. A lot of colleges go, oh, what do I do with this? Because of the student disclosed disability on their college application. And then it goes to a bunch of people. And while we talk about, confidentiality and privacy and maintaining your ability to disclose as you choose, that doesn't happen if you put it on an application. So those are the factors that I would think about is there an accommodation necessary during the application process? And if so, yes, disclosure would be appropriate. Otherwise, I don't feel that the application process is the appropriate time and place to disclose that. So
that makes sense. Heather, yes, please chime in.
I thought I would also share that it may be helpful to know that by putting that information in an application, that's not the equivalent of requesting accommodations. There's usually at a university a process for requesting accommodations that it does not involve admissions at all. And so submitting documentation with an application to a university is not going to necessarily guarantee that the disability resource program is receiving that information, because we are often entirely separate.
Very good point, Heather.
Yeah, and especially like Cindy mentioned, I work at University of Michigan. It is an enormous university, and there are multiple admissions spaces and places. So there's like a main app, there's the school application process to like apply for the specific school that you want to get into. So all of those places and spaces we are not connected directly to, and it would not be disclosing disability for the purpose of gaining academic accommodations once you were admitted and taking classes. So thank you, Heather.
And just one other thought, because you mentioned, Cody, it can depend. One scenario where I might think about disclosing is if my high school transcript reflects not having taken something that the university I'm applying to requires. Mm-hmm. And that was because of an accommodation I received in high school. Then I would likely share in my application to that university, I did not take spoken foreign language. As a deaf individual, I did something, so that is why you do not see foreign language courses on my application, and then explain how I still met that requirement.
Yeah.
So there's usually very limited instances where I might mention disability, but otherwise exactly what Cody said.
Yeah.
I see a comment that says if a student has an IEP, that's obvious from the transcript. So I think this varies also state to state. I'll be completely honest. In Michigan, we don't allow transcripts to disclose if a student had an IEP. So they may have like a class, like deduction may do that, but that's not always a given. And some students are in those classes with or without an IEP. So for at least in Michigan, that's not an obvious. So I'm not sure where you're from, Melissa, but that may be a difference in statewide. And I think that there is a difference between disclosure in the application process directly versus submitting documentation required for the application process that may allude to but not confirm. So I do think that they're not allowed to use that information in the application process. So yeah.
But
Okay.
let me ask a follow-up question. But if they say write an essay that says I overcame this, so I learned how to manage my dyslexia or ADHD or something, that's different than disclosing. And it has to be a purpose of, I'm writing this to show you my growth and my strength, and that I'm bringing something to the campus, rather than, I have this, you have to know. Is that accurate? Does it matter how they just, like, if they put it in an essay, is that different from disclosure?
From an ADA standpoint, from an accommodations related to disabilities standpoint, disclosure is a legal term. So there's talking about my disability. You can talk about your disability. That disclosure, though, is a specific act of stating I am a student or with a disability, or I'm a disabled student, and am therefore requesting ADA-based accommodations for my college experience, educational experience. So I think that is maybe where this is different. While there may be things that show an IEP was had in high school, that student has not yet disclosed or requested academic accommodations at the collegiate level. There is a difference in that process. So talking about having note on their IEP that they had a study skills or resource room, like I said, I worked in K-12 for many years, and I had many students that were in the classes in study skills and resource room that were not necessarily IEP or 504. They may have been just on the edge, or, so I think it depends, again, on what your student, where you are, what is disclosed on those transcripts, and how that information is being used. So having a transcript submitted to an application process is a transcript submitted to an application process. They're typically not deep diving. They're not typically deep diving. Oop, am I still there?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. My screen went black. I apologize. All of a sudden, nobody was there. So they're not deep diving, trying to figure out what resource room or study skills means. What they're looking for is, did you take the right math? We said you had to have this many levels of science. Did you, in a lot of cases, because they can't look at the other stuff, because it would be suspect if they mentioned that kind of thing. So disclosure is really a legal term to indicate a specific kind of process of requesting academic accommodations. To clarify, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's something, and we're going to get farther into this, because that's the key thing. That's where we're having to shift gears. Yes, and I see, Melissa's and others talk about, I've had students write about, their learning difference, even those terms, how they built resilience and how they overcame it and all of those things, but that's different than disclosing. So go ahead, Heidi.
And I think this kind of piggybacks. Heather, I was hoping that maybe you could articulate, what does the accommodation process look like? We kind of discussed, and Cody brought this up, disclosing your disability is a legal term. And what does that look like? What can an IEC expect their student to go through in that process look like, timeframes? And maybe what are some challenges of accessing services if it's not done in a timely manner or after the fact?
I was thinking I might share two things. First of all, as students are looking at universities, I know it can be valuable to find out and kind of have some information about what's your university process, what do you offer, what do I need to do to request at your university. So students may want to have a sense of, if I go to this institution, what process do I need to go through? Will it be supportive? Will I get the resources I need so I have an accessible experience? And so there's kind of the I'm exploring different options to decide which one's going to be the best fit for me. Once I've decided which institution I'm going to go to, I've applied, I've been admitted, then the process allows students can actually make a formal request. Typically, before you're admitted to a university, you may not start a formal process. You may just have an informational process. But once you're admitted and you've committed, You have a university identification number. For example, at Illinois, the actual request that a student can complete, or a prospective student, asks for your university identification number. So without that, you wouldn't be able to submit the request, but we'd be happy to answer questions, of course. But so the process starts with the student fills out that request, or we assist with the student with filling out that request. The student shares typically any history of accommodations that they've used. That can be in the form of an IEP, a 504 plan, their description of what they've used. And then we ask for documentation from a healthcare provider confirming what the nature of the disability is. And the crucial piece of information is that student's description of how are those disabilities that they're documenting, how do they impact in the academic realm or in the housing realm in the case of someone who may be requesting a housing accommodation. So we then review all that information the student shared. We would likely then move forward to schedule a time for us to meet. So in the post-secondary level, when you get to ADA versus IDEA, we actually have to engage in an interactive process with each student, which means we would give them a chance to share additional information. Like in my case, I would often ask a student, so tell me what accommodations you've used before, or tell me how your disability impacts just in your day-to-day experience. And then I might delve into, so let's think about like lecture environments, testing environments when you're studying. And so I really want to learn from the student exactly what their own description of functional impact is. So as families and students are looking to applying, one thing that may be helpful is kind of coaching students about how to describe their disability, because I know that can be a new thing for many students, particularly students who are newly diagnosed and are newly looking into disability accommodations.
Can I piggyback just a little bit too, Heather, on this? When I'm working with a student and they might have a disability that impacts their housing. So could be an allergy. They may have an emotional support animal. They may have a visual impairment, whatever it is. I think it's really important for IECs and parents out there in the audience to know that that accommodation process should start really early. So as soon as that student's admitted and they know they're going to need a housing accommodation, they should start the accommodation process and getting registers with these departments ASAP. Reason being, housing accommodations in college can start as early as mid-May. So the sooner that they are registered with the Office of Disability Services can make the housing accommodation request, the more likely their needs are going to be met in the fall. So that's just, I think, is really important when it comes to a time frame and the urgency of making sure documentation is up to speed and we're getting that paperwork into the appropriate departments early.
And something that's also important to know is that all the information that we gather with students is in our own data management system, our own records. It's not part of admissions in the university. So we can have open discussion, discuss all the impacts, and then create an accommodation plan with the student. So then the student can notify, maybe it's housing, or maybe, once they register for classes and they're going to start, they'll have a mechanism to notify each of their instructors about their approved accommodations.
Yeah.
My recommendation to students as they're starting this process is, let's do it as early as possible so you know what your plan is. And then as you're about to start classes or as you're about to move into the residential experience, you'll be able to do so with accommodations already approved. I know some students may want to wait and kind of see how classes are, because it's not always clear how classes may be structured. And I understand that. So it may be that some students delay a little bit to share the letter of accommodation with their professors because they want to understand the structure of the class. But I wouldn't delay too long, because you don't want to get into a situation where I've already taken an exam and it's going to have a really big impact on my grade at the end of the semester, and I didn't let anybody know that I have testing accommodations. So again, I would stress all of the documentation is going to be in the disability resource programs records. There's no, even if you share the letter of accommodation, you're not locked into using them, but you've alerted the people who need to know, so you're able to then move forward with scheduling those accommodations.
And what Heather said too, I think is important. According to the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, accommodations are not retroactive. So if a student eligible for accommodation is already registered with the department, but doesn't request the support from their faculty member and takes that exam, even though they could get time and a half, but they took the exam, they never went through the proper channels, they can't go back and retake that same exam with accommodations. It doesn't work that way. So I think it's really important for us professionals who are guiding these students to help them recognize what are the consequences of these decisions. If they wait, they may not be able to get their needs met. So knowing that about the law is really important, so that the students aren't like, oh shoot, I failed 3 exams in September. I really wish I could have gotten my time and a half.
Sarah,
good point.
you asked a question in the chat, and I just wanted to differentiate 2 things that I was sharing. So we have an informational process, which is not a formal request process, but we're giving you, the student, information, or the prospective student information about how to request, what's available, versus if someone is going to formally request an accommodation, they need to be admitted to the university. So there are potentially 2 ways that we might initially meet with a student. We can actually just have an informational meeting and talk about the process. Or the student can actually formally start the process. But at that point, they need to be an admitted student.
And to echo Heather and go to Sarah, and then I'll follow up a different point that Heidi made too. At University of Michigan, we have what's called a prospective student meeting. So prospective students come in, we talk in generality. This is not a meeting that we actually review documentation with you. We don't talk about very detailed specifics. This is more to get a general overview of what the actual process may look like once you're admitted, the kinds of supports, the kinds of accommodations students with similar barriers. That's one thing I do want to talk about too, is terminology may be slightly different university to university. We use the word barrier a lot. So knowing how to describe your disability is useful. Knowing what your disability means is useful. But for us, I need to know what your barriers are. What barriers does that disability create in an academic learning environment? So I'm less concerned that you can tell me that migraines cause headaches, because I can look that up. I need to know, when you have those headaches, how does that impact your ability to participate and gain equal access in the academic environment? So therefore, it might be, when I have a migraine, I can't look at a computer. So therefore, I can't complete my homework that is due because Tuesday I was assigned it and my next class is Thursday. I got a migraine on Wednesday. I'm not going to get it done. So we have to have those kinds of conversations. And it's really important that students understand how their disability creates the barriers. If they come in and go, I have ADHD. Okay, what does that mean though? Well, like, I can't focus. Okay, so we're going to pull and pull and pull and pull. And we will use documentation to ask questions if their documentation is more than just, we can confirm the student has ADHD. Sometimes documentation, we'll talk about that too, but knowing the barriers is really important in that disclosure process, because it helps determine what are the reasonable accommodations. And then Heidi, thank you for bringing up the retroactivity, because I actually wrote it down to include, because that is a really significant, huge change between K-12 accommodations and higher ed accommodations that students struggle with. I weekly receive emails that are like, hey, I should have probably sent this to my instructor. I didn't. Can you let them know that I actually do have disability, because I was like late on a paper last week and they're telling me they don't take late papers, but I have this disability. And I'm like, but you didn't request the accommodations and you didn't give your letter to them. I can do nothing. I can say, oh, that sucks. And let me walk you through how you might approach this situation. But it's ultimately on the professor to make the determination if they're going to provide an academic adjustment versus an accommodation. And accommodations are not retroactive at the collegiate level. So that's a big one. So anyway.
And that's a big part of what we're really focusing on today. I mean, this is such a huge topic, you know, what she put in essay, all that stuff, but we're really trying to talk about the difference between the law at K-12 and the law in higher education. And so many, both counselors, parents, and students don't realize that there is a difference. So that's what we really want to.
I can jump into that if you wanted.
Do you want to do the law?
I can flip those since we're on it, and we can go backwards a little bit. We can jump around.
Mm-hmm.
You're good.
So, you know, in K-12, the main law that governs accommodations is IDEA, IDEA. We're all familiar with it. Well, mostly all familiar with it. The main law for college level accommodations is ADA. 504 crosses both, but it functions differently in K-12 than it does in college level. And, you know, simplistically, in a very basic way, we always say to students, IDEA is kind of success-based. So the goal is we want every student to succeed in K-12. And so IDEA cares about your success. And ADA, it's not that they don't care about your success, but they don't. They care about your access. So they want to create an equitable environment, and the success is up to you. They really don't care if you pass your test. They're not going to give you 5 tries. You're not going to have the same experiences accommodation-wise. One really big thing is there is a lot more justice. This can vary from college to college, but in general, things like having a formula sheet becomes very much like, is this reasonable? Is it providing success or is it providing access? What is the barrier that determines if a formula sheet is necessary? So that's just what we have a lot of formula sheets, things like calculator use, things like having a private room. You may have had a private room in K-12 because that's what you preferred, that's what you asked for, that's what the school gave you, and you had it. But in college, they may go, you don't have a barrier that says you can't be in a limited distraction testing environment. So there's a lot of that to consider and think about, because success is very different than access. And so a lot of universities are really evaluating differently than an IEP was determined. I see that there is a question from Ryan. Does anybody want to ask or follow up while I read the question?
So Cody, I wanted to, for the IECs out there or parents out there, I think it's really important to start thinking about, what is your student right now in high school? What are they receiving? What kind of supports are they getting in their 504, maybe their IEP, or maybe kind of informally? Maybe they meet with somebody on a weekly basis, not even outlined in their doc, but it's really helpful for their executive functioning. Or maybe, you know, they didn't really have to take a language. So think about some of these supports that they're getting in high school. Now, the question is, are they going to translate into the post-secondary setting? And if they're not,
right. So tutoring.
Let's start weaning those students out. I work with students in junior year. If I see that they use a note card on exams, I'm like, we got to get that off of your IEP, because I know that is not going to translate. So what other things can we do while you're a junior or a senior in high school that's going to help you learn the tools you need so that you're going to have the success you need in college? So really be mindful of those supports, and really kind of vet them with the college environment. Because I would say we don't want to start bad habits.
And there's nothing, I will be completely fully transparent. I've worked in small private colleges with, you know, the number of the entire campus is almost my University of Michigan caseload. I've worked at community college. So I've worked K-12. So I've run the gamut. I will say, as someone who works in the Disability Accessibility Office, if a student wrote to me and said, hey, I'm a junior at such and such high school, can I make can we sit down and talk so that I can see what may or may not like be reasonable in college so that I can work with my transition team? I would be like, sure, make an appointment as a prospective student. That would be a very reasonable way to use that prospective student. And while we don't promise these are going to be your accommodations, we can say, ooh, yeah, no, you won't get you likely will not get note cards on your test. We would have to talk about what that would look like. That would also be a time that documentation and maybe learning why those barriers because never say never is also, you can't ever say no completely we have to consider everything individually, and we do. I want to add that caveat too. We don't just cookie cutter stamp, well, ADHD gets this and did it, you know what I mean? Like everybody is very different, which is why when a student says, I have ADHD, we're like, and what does that mean to you? Because it's completely different. Everybody, is individual fingerprints. So, so yes, I think that is a really great way to have a student like practice self-advocacy, is possibly reaching out. And even if they don't make an appointment, maybe emailing somebody in an office at a university where they're considering, or even just the local community college, so that they can hear like, hey, it's, not usually determined reasonable that you can have your personal assistant sit in with you and read your test and explain the questions. Like that's typically not going to be something that's going to be considered reasonable at a collegiate level. So that's a pretty extreme one, but you can ask those questions. And I think that would be an appropriate time to do so. So, and going back, I think parents should be engaged pre-transition or during that transition period. Our college welcomes parents. I don't welcome parents treating me poorly because they're upset, but I do welcome parents as part of the process because students are nervous and it is their first time. And sometimes parents have very good information to add to the conversation. What I always say to parents when I talk about it is let your student lead and you're supplemental. You're the supplemental role. And I do see that there's guardianship after their child turns 18, depending on the name. And that's a determination you may have to make. Maybe the student needs some modeling. So while you let them lead, you're also side by side modeling with them. I still think self-advocacy and letting them take the lead role and being supplement, whether or not guardianship is there, does nothing more than empower them. And if they need assistance, you're there and you're supplementing and you're picking up where they didn't. And I think that's totally appropriate. So I don't think it's viewed negatively by the college until it becomes where the parent is now taking over the role of what the student should be doing. So we view students 18 and older, even if they have a guardianship established, they are an adult. They're an adult that has to learn how to do adult roles, which is self-advocacy is one of them. And we expect a student to take on the ability to let us know, I'm having issues, this and this. Now we understand that doesn't come naturally or easily and isn't just something that, oh, I'm 18, poof, now I can do it. So if you are going to write an office to advocate for your child, I would highly encourage you to include your child. Or my big push, because I'll disclose, I am the mother of 7 and 4 of them are disabled. And so my big thing is I will show my child how to write an email to the office. Then it's not me writing the email, but it is. But I'm showing them how to do it so it goes to them and it will come back to them. If you have guardianship, I think sometimes that might allow you to be CC'd, but much of our communication goes directly to that student's university email. And so if you have guardianship, you can present that to the office. I have guardianship. Here's a FERPA, like that supersedes FERPA. please include me on communications. We make a note, it goes into our system, and we can work with that. But typically, it still would be the student that we communicate with. If a parent writes me and they don't include their student, I actually respond to the student with their parent's email, like as a forward. And I don't CC that parent until I know either a FERPA is signed, or if in the case of guardianship, there's a guardianship, or that student writes back and CCs the parent. Then I will reply all, but I don't typically immediately respond to parents. I welcome it, but I don't only communicate with parents. The student has to be part of the process.
And I think, Cody, I think it's beautiful to talk about the parent. We have to recognize that this is a transition for parents too. And a lot of times parents don't understand how their roles are going to change based on the law. And they have advocated so well under IDEA, and they've been so involved in K through 12. It really does get cut off. And to Cody's point, I know when I was in higher ed, my allegiance was with that student, not with their parent. And I needed that student to trust me, to come to me to ask for what they needed. Now that does take modeling. And one thing that I do now to help students, let's kind of pivot into self-advocacy, Heather and Cody, but the importance of self-advocacy is so critical because, to Cody's point, we need a student to be able to communicate. When I was in higher ed and I was sitting across from a potential student and I'd say, what have you been diagnosed with? And they look over at their mom and they expect their mom to answer that question. That's not going to fly. I need that student to know what they've been diagnosed with. So now when I'm working with a junior in high school, I'm like, okay, we're going to take this documentation and we're going to dissect it. Let's get to know ourselves. Let's get to know our disability, how it impacts me, and find language that works for you. What works for me may not work with the student I'm working with. So we don't expect them to say, I've been diagnosed with a DSM-5 diagnosis. No. They can say, I've got a learning disability. It really impacts my reading comprehension. So reading in class can be really challenging for me to know exactly what I should be comprehending. And then especially if somebody asks me a question right away where I don't have time to process it. Therefore, time and a half has been really helpful for me. That's all they really need to say. My goal is to help them find language as a junior and senior in high school so that they are prepared to talk to Cody and Heather about their disability and what they need in order to be successful in those classroom in the next adventure. Heather and Cody, please talk about your advocacy expectations and tools and those sorts of things from your vantage point.
I wanted to share one additional thought for everyone who's participating today, and that is to remember that when we are determining accommodations, we're doing it based upon knowing what that individual student's experience is. And so secondhand information is maybe helpful for context, but we really rely upon that student. And so that's why it's crucial to keep the student at the center of it. It's not that we're trying to cut out parents at all. It's really because the information about what is being experienced, what the barriers are, as Cody shared, that's going to come from the student. So that's why it's so important to work with the student, coach them, help them learn how to share that information so that we can then work with them to identify accommodations. And hopefully, based upon what they describe, in addition to what they may be requesting, we may also make additional recommendations for accommodations.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Heather. That is why we talk barriers and not diagnosis. Like the documentation is really the diagnosis. We just need that to go, yep, okay, qualifies as disabled under the law. And sometimes it provides important stuff for us, but typically we're going off that narrative with the student, and we want those barriers because that student may have had 2 or 3 things on their IEP, and if we only went off that, they might not have access at a collegiate level. So when we have those conversations and talk about those barriers, that student might reveal something and I might go, well, I don't see that you used like note-taking in high school, but it sounds like your teachers all recorded class and you had access to that. At our university, depending on the program, the school, not all of the instructors record, so you might benefit from audio recording. But we also offer all of our students the opportunity to trial Glean, which is Glean is a note-taking app. There are various ones. Otter is a really great one. If anybody saw that in the comments, I've used that at past universities. So they all vary. But we might introduce a student to a technology or another accommodation that may give them access at a collegiate level that they didn't need because, again, K-12 also has a different kind of universal design. The goal is success. There is different things that may have occurred that are not going to occur necessarily at a collegiate level. So that's why I do encourage parents to engage because, if I'm a new student transitioning to college, I've got 1,000 different things that are going to make me go, when I ask, tell me about your disability. And they might get some of it out, but then the parent's like, hey, don't forget when you read aloud, you can't comprehend what you're reading. So if you're expected to then answer a question after a read aloud section, and so there's all that really makes, yes, Cocoa Note is another really good one. Yeah. I encourage that to be a question that you talk with your students. Like, are there technologies that may need to replace some of the accommodations that they have, or would be good to introduce the student to now, even if it's just resource and not accommodation based? I do know, like at University of Michigan, all students, regardless of being registered with our office or not, there's a whole page of IT tools, AI tools that are available, and one of them is Read Write. All students have access to Read Write, so we don't even control that. That license is for every accepted and registered U of M student. So when a student comes in and goes, I need something, here you go. Not it, we don't have to put it as an accommodation because you have it. It's part of the universal design, but not all are like that. So those are the kinds of things to kind of get to you to know about your student. And junior year is a really good year because they've had a couple years to settle into high school and see that more advanced work, but they're not yet headed into college. So they have a few years to try a few things before they get there. So yes.
Heather, anything you want to add about self-advocacy or?
Another thing I was going to suggest is that I don't expect all students, prospective students, incoming students to know what is available. Hopefully, if I'm meeting with someone to talk about their disability, I'm going to have recommendations that I make based upon what they describe the barriers are. In addition to, if they have a specific request, that's great, and we'll talk about that. But I think it's helpful for families to know we are not necessarily expecting you to have, like, I'm going to request A, B, and C, and then we're not going to make any additional requests. Hopefully we are adding to what, we would recommend based upon what's described. And also, it's not just a one-time thing. I tell students when I meet with them, if anything changes, whether that's the nature of your classes or your disability changes, and you think that that's pointing to a need to revisit the accommodation plan, then reach out and we'll do that. We'll re-engage in the interactive process and determine if we need to make adjustments to the accommodations that the student is using or will be using.
Yeah, that's a great point, Heather. That would be another piece of that self-advocacy. Reach out right away, because sometimes it may not be something that I can do, but our office is going to refer you. We have resources internally and externally that we can refer you to. And I know that was one of the questions that we were going to discuss, is that accommodations are just a one part of the puzzle of coming to college. And so campus resources are very rich at most campuses. And that would be a question that I would ask if you had a prospective student meeting, is what resources outside of accommodations do you have to support students in their academic experience? That would be a key thing, because sometimes it's not an accommodation thing. Tutoring is not an accommodation at a collegiate level. Tutoring can be provided in a K-12 level as an accommodation, depending on the student. It is not at a collegiate level. Our office handles no tutoring, none,
Mhm.
zero zilch, but we do have a million tutoring resources, and we are partners. So students services for students with disabilities is under the umbrella of student access and accommodation services, so which is huge. And one of those components under that umbrella, which is not in our office but under the umbrella, is academic success and accommodation partnerships or access partnerships. And it's an executive functioning coaching program. So they offer academic coaching, non-tutoring, but they also then offer peer assisted support sessions. They offer some tutoring. Our office doesn't handle tutoring, but our office provides tutoring grant money. So you can apply for some additional funding if the university itself does not have the right tutoring resource for you and you need that. We can then fund you to find your own tutor. So there's lots of things to be looking at when you're looking at a university outside of accommodations only, because it's like trying to say that I want a cake and all you're asking for is an egg, because you're not going to get a cake. You're going to get an egg and it's going to be gross and it's not going to taste the same. And, you need the sugar and the flour and the baking soda powder and everything to get in there to make the cake the best cake. And that's what you want, is a cake experience. So
Yeah, and Cody, that's something that I definitely do when we're looking at suggested college lists and I'm working with an IEC. They're working on, okay, what's the size of the school? What majors do they have? What's the, where are they located? I'm looking at what kind of academic supports do these schools have as well that are going to meet the students' needs. And then we marry those two when we're proposing the college lists to the student, because you're right, it needs to be a whole full picture, especially for those students who are reliant on academic support. So yeah, I'm with you on that one. I want to real quick, because I know
And
we're
Carmen
running.
has a question.
Sorry.
Sorry,
Carmen.
No,
Go
that's
ahead,
okay.
Carmen.
I think this is kind of piggybacking on what you were mentioning with the colleges as well as like the accommodations, but are there certain majors you recommend for students with barriers?
are there certain majors that you would recommend? No. I don't think that there are majors that no. I'm like,
Really
I mean,
wanna
you
know
might do
what
a
the student is interested
Yeah.
in. And then from that, I might look at and want to have some discussion about, well, what do you think the nature of the classes or the program is going to be, so that we can look at accommodation planning around that. I too, and another thing that actually alludes to is, I would say disability resource programs often are not involved in academic coaching, or sorry, academic advising. I misspoke there. So we're not often in that space of saying, based upon what you're describing, we think you should go into this program or that program or otherwise. We're usually the ones that are, based upon the program that you've chosen, let's talk about what that involves so we can create a plan with you.
Yeah, I agree completely with that, Heather. I echo that. I wouldn't tell a student this is where you should go because you have this specific disability. I would say, what are you interested in? Let's talk about how that would look within the classroom, what accommodations might be necessary. But I would say there isn't a major. I will say that there are some colleges where certain majors may have more pushback within their program, which is why it's really important to visit and discuss and get a feel yourself on how that experience may be for you. Like I said, I've worked in a variety of different spaces and places, and I can tell you some places are like, yep, come on in, we'll make it work. I will tell you that the engineering program at U of M, if you have any engineering students, not to not to push us, but I haven't had quite the experience. They're just like, all right, let's make this work. How can we make it work? There are a bunch of engineers that are very logic driven, and they're like, we can just make it work. And so that's been a very refreshing experience to have requests that we send that we're like, we're gonna get pushed back, and they're like, no, let's make it work. Versus I've been in university experiences where some of their medical based majors are a little more like, but that's not your student's job to fight that. So that's the other piece why I wouldn't tell a student, don't go for what you want to go for, because it's not their job to do that. So they would get their accommodations. They would be able to go where they were appropriate. I will say that at a collegiate level, one thing to consider is that a student must be able to satisfy the requirements of a program with or without accommodation. So you can't eliminate certain parts. There are certain programs that have state licensure requirements that cannot be changed. A lot of times, especially in technical fields, and also when you go into like master's PhD programs, thinking way ahead into the future, there are certain like programmatic deadlines and policies and processes that cannot be adjusted or accommodated certain ways. So there are some things to consider, but I wouldn't tell a student not to do it. They still can. It's just they would have to know ahead of time, like, let's plan ahead, like Heather said, let's talk about this so that you know before you get there how this is going to flow. But I would never, no, go for what you want to go for. You're going to get it. So.
Well, we've got just a few more minutes, but I want to really re-emphasize something that we've been talking about, and this was really revealing for me when we had our preliminary conversation, is we do shy away from using the term disability as counselors, and explain why you can't do that at a college level.
I'll take that one, ladies, because I'm really passionate about this term. So working in higher ed, you think about our laws that govern us: Americans with Disabilities Act, IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act. Oftentimes, departments like Cody's and Heather's have disability in their title. And disability is the umbrella. You can have a visible or invisible disability: hearing impaired, visually impaired, neurodiversity, mental health diversity. It's all under this lovely umbrella of disability. So if we are helping our student prepare for college, we've got to help them prepare for that terminology. And what I've noticed, this shift that I've had working in higher ed for so long and shifting to work with K through 12 families, they shy away from this term. They use other terminology. They almost like, oh, but they don't really have if we shy away from this term as a disability, or because we are fearful of what the student is going to feel about this term, my fear is they're going to shy away from the support they need to be successful. So if we embrace this term, and I don't expect all of my students to come in there and use it right off the bat, but I am going to continue to use the term disability when I work with them. And I'm going to explain to them why it's important, because if they're going to need their needs to be met in higher ed, they're probably going to have to say, I am a student with a disability. And if they can't say that, that is a problem. So let's have that conversation when they're in junior, go over their documentation, help them find their language, help them get comfortable with this term. The more likely they're going to seek the support they need. So I lean heavily into this term. I would encourage other IECs out there too. Now, I'm not saying you have to have your students say it, but I think you need to become familiar with this term, feel okay using it, because the more you are, the more normal it comes from your mouth, the easier your students are going to accept it. So Heather, Cody, please chime in. What's your thoughts on this?
I'm gonna, go ahead, Cody.
Nope, go ahead.
I was gonna say that it's really helpful to remember that disability is the language in the guidance that we have. So we're really trying to make sure we understand what the disability is. Also, when we talk about euphemism, using other words, that can lead to some, it can what's the right way to say, it can detract from what we are actually trying to understand and confuse or somehow change what you're actually trying to speak about. I want to know what the disability experience is. And also I know that it's hard for, if I'm an individual that's never owned language that is disability, it's a process to learn to be comfortable with that. But to be aware that universities are probably going to be using that language. Also, it's another piece to it is that many of us work with disability communities. And so it's a cultural experience too. And it's a positive one. Disability is neither, it's not meant to be a stigma, a derogatory term. It's also a cultural experience that's a really important thing for us to celebrate. And so, but whenever, I want to be as clear as possible. So I'm going to talk about disability. I'm not going to use other words to try to substitute that and somehow, water down the meaning of what I'm actually, what my role is at the university. I also want students to know that if they want to request disability accommodations, I want my office to be absolutely clear what we do. So if disability is in my title, that helps prospective students find me, or students who are here that may need to request accommodations.
Yes, I agree. We work from a disability identity model, and at least me as a human, and I recognize that there are still people that do not. But because of that, we talk a lot about, I don't separate myself from my other parts. I don't hide those away. I don't try to call, my eyes a different color than they are. I don't try to call my hair a different color than it is. I might dye it, but that's different. We don't talk about that. That's age denial. But we don't expect other people either. We don't call sicknesses. I don't go, oh, I have just a little touch of the sniffy sniff. I have a cold. We're not embarrassed to talk about certain things. So there doesn't need to be a stigma or an identity crisis about that. We're made up by the parts of who we are, and we try to be pretty matter of fact about the intersectionalities that occur with who you are. I did see a note about college websites, and I know we're running out of time, and I will just say, if you're struggling to find it, look up disability. Just type disability in the search bar. That's going to bring up that office, whether or not it's in their title or not, because it's going to be somewhere on their page, because like Heather said, that's the central word that runs and oversees our offices. So
Nola, your point is really an important one, which is if the university you're looking at doesn't use the word disability, it's likely going to use the word access somewhere in the name. So, and that comes from the phrase access and inclusion. So if we don't use the word disability, we're likely going to use the word access somewhere in our title.
Nola, I would encourage you, I don't know what state you're in, but I would encourage you, if they don't have a 2-click ability to find the Office of Accessibility, to write them. That's kind of the law's encouragement, is that it should not be more than like a 2-click, which includes the search bar, sadly. But I encourage you, that's a great way to advocate for your students.
Love it.
That is so great. There is so much we could do. We could spend, a whole week on all of this. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for being here as participants, as an audience. The conversation is always so lively, and I really encourage that. I hope you'll join me at the end of April 25th. I'm going to have Eric Dillahoy, who is also an IEC, who's also a producer. He's a writer. He's doing a lot of creative arts things right now, but he's going to come talk about the LGBTQ community and our students, transgender students we work with. What do we need to be thinking about for safety and quality of life for our students? So no one has all the answers right now. We really don't know what the future is going to hold, but there are certain things that we can take into consideration. So Eric's going to be joining me for that. Also, I hope that you consider I'm doing some workshops. I've had some this week. Next week, I'm going to be doing workshops on essays and just, I don't even know. There's just a bunch of different topics that I'm going to do. So Carmen, if you can stick that in the chat. Next one, I'm doing essay workshop on part 2 on structure and review. I'm going to do dynamic college search and college lists. It's on April 9th. April 10th, the essay. April 11th, we're going to talk about in strategic enrollment management, kind of the inside that process. I will tell you the most popular video I have on my whole YouTube channel is Christine Bowman going through Slate. I get more hits on that than anything else. So we're going to talk about that. That's going to be on April 11th. And so those are all next week. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Cody Marie. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Carmen, for being here today. And thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.